All right, hello and welcome to part 5 of my examination and critique of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Social Contract. Today we're going to be covering Book 2, chapters 4 and 5. The titles of these chapters are The Limits of the Sovereign Power and The Right of Life and Death. And this appears to be the beginning of Rousseau's, let's call it, effort to rehabilitate his system and get it away from the rather totalitarian descriptions that he's given us so far. He doesn't do a very good job, and there's a lot of holes in it, but let's get to it. So starting with chapter 4, again, the limits of sovereign power. Rousseau says that the state, in order to preserve itself, quote, must have a universal and compelling force in order to move and dispose each part as may be most advantageous to the whole, end quote. Now, this, of course, is classic overstatement. Private security and arbitration systems prove that it is excessive to say that that the state must have a universal and compelling force in all circumstances, and to move and dispose each part as may be advantageous to the whole. These are things that can be done, and often are done, in more decentralized ways, and there's no reason why Rousseau must insist on all power going to the state. He continues, quote, we are bound then to distinguish clearly between the respective rights of the citizens and the sovereign, and between the duties the former have to fulfill as subjects, and the natural rights they should enjoy as men, end quote. Here, Rousseau is beginning to try to illuminate some kind of limits on the state, but he really has no coherent concept of natural rights that he's working from. Locke at least had some definitions, and Locke referred us to Richard Hooker's Of the Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity. Rousseau does neither, and that's part of the problem here. Rousseau is borrowing the language of classical liberalism with a lot of sloppy use, such that these definitions are either very different from what Locke or Sidney or Richard Hooker would say, and yet he still uses the same words because he seems to lack the creativity to actually kind of think through these things and come up with either new phrases or provide the definitions first. As we've seen, he kind of has been hammering on the idea that the state has this totalitarian power, and right about now he's starting to see that his stuff is looking pretty bad at this point. The point that he's making here kind of brings to mind the first two chapters of Locke's second treatise, where he talks about natural law. You can look, I'll have a link in the show notes where you can see my coverage, including a link to a free copy of Richard Hooker's book. Rousseau continues, quote, each man alienates, I admit, by the social compact only such part of his powers, goods, and liberty as it is important for the community to control. But it must also be granted that the sovereign is the sole judge of what's important, end quote. Again, the judge of the limits of the powers of the state is a phantom. There is no clear way to distinguish between legitimate powers of the state and illegitimate powers of the state because there is no sovereign. The sovereign is a imaginary construct, and because it is an imaginary construct, actual people must, declare and interpret what the intentions of the sovereign are. Since people are, both, flawed and, have limited perspective and tend to serve their own purposes, we're going to find that if the sovereign must be defined by some group of people, that group of people is always going to have a significant advantage over the rest of society. In footnote 1, Rousseau begs not to be charged with self-contradiction. He says he needs more time because, quote, the terminology made it unavoidable, end quote. We're going to see a lot of this in the next two chapters, and I would argue that it might make sense I would argue that if Rousseau didn't want to be misunderstood in this way, or didn't want to be charged with self-contradiction, then he should detail the limitations earlier or organize things better. Blaming the terminology is ridiculous since he hasn't used that many technical terms from other authors in a significant way, at least in the same sense that those authors use them. He's not borrowing from much. For instance, Locke also talked about a social contract, but it's a very different thing than Rousseau's. For more from Locke, you might want to check out his essay called An Essay Concerning Human Understanding, links in the show notes. Rousseau continues, quote, the sovereign cannot impose upon its subjects any fetters that are useless to the community, nor can it even wish to do so, end quote. This is a word, useless is a word that is absolutely in need of definition here. Or no, wait, why don't we let the worst people in society define what useless is, and then see how good our definition is? I suspect that things that are useless for the state to do, when given to the hands of people who are themselves self-serving in government, that useless becomes the null set. Rousseau continues, social responsibilities are, quote, obligatory only because they are mutual, end quote, and we inevitably are working for ourselves when we are also working for others. This is yet another case where the iron law of oligarchy is devastating for Rousseau's framework. Even if these responsibilities are mutual, there will always be those who give orders and those who are forced to obey, and nothing in Rousseau's arguments so far has suggested otherwise, has suggested any way to differentiate these things or to separate these things in any way other than what people decide. Rousseau continues, quote, the general will must be general in its object as well as its essence, that it must both come from all and apply to all, and that it loses its natural rectitude when it is directed to some particular and determinate object, because in such a case we are judging of something foreign to us, and have no true principle of equity to guide us, end quote. This is kind of gibberishy, but he's getting at something that actually might be meaningful. Basically, he's perverting Locke and Hooker's conception of natural law as kind of being like this self-consistent and generally based on axioms moral system, axioms which are kind of generally agreeable, that you can't, that a rational person would agree to because, you know, thou shalt not murder kind of stuff. The reason that that a rational person would be expected to accept these axioms, thou shalt not murder, is because denying them would make that person vulnerable to a turnabout. If you do not believe that murder is immoral, then you may be murdered. Rousseau is basically using kind of a bizarre definition of law here, because he's basically saying anytime that the law pokes at something particular, it can't be the will of the sovereign, or it can't be the general will. And, you know, this is something that he's going to elaborate on in the rest of this chapter, but it's not a very well argued point, I think, and we'll see why. Rousseau continues, whenever the agents of the sovereign focus down on one particular person or group of persons, it is acting as a magistrate, not as sovereign. Quote, when, for instance, the people of Athens nominated or displaced its rulers, decreed honors to one and imposed penalties on another, and by a multitude of particular decrees exercised all the functions of government indiscriminately, it had in such cases no longer a general will in the strict sense, end quote. Rousseau is really harping on this universality principle because it's the only way that he can kind of save himself. But what we're going to see is that it affects the structure of what he calls law in a very weird way. But realistically, there's no way to differentiate between magistrate orders and the sovereign law when it's applied to individual cases. We don't have any way to gather the end of a general will, and we don't have a way to distinctively say this is something that is particular and this is something that is general. There are tricks and workarounds to get away from that. In practice, governments organized under Rousseau's framework will tailor the law to discriminate in clever ways. Evil doesn't mean stupid, which will generally nudge the people in certain directions. For instance, look at the tax law, right? Look at how taxes have been expanded to the point where any nudge the government wishes to do falls under the definition or umbrella of tax, at least according to the government. Rousseau again starts to demand for more time to, quote, expound my own, end quote, views. It's almost as if he realizes he's dug his own grave with his sloppy language, and is kind of backpedaling here, trying to save something. Trying to say, oh no, wait, I'm going to back this off a little bit, but he's not doing a very good job of it. The line between an idealist and a totalitarian is, of course, pretty thin, right? It takes very little effort to go from, I believe this is how things should be, to how I think things should be must be enforced by violence or threats of violence, especially when you've thrown away things like principled limits in the interest of a simpler definition, right? Rousseau has this very short definition early on of what the social contract must be, but like he's doing that because he wants to simplify things, but all he's really doing is creating a big hole for himself to dig himself out of. Rousseau continues, quote, every authentic act of the general will binds or favors all the citizens equally, so that the sovereign recognizes only the body of the nation and draws no distinctions between those of whom it is made up. This, end quote. This is a fantasy. Laws can always be made to not specifically target one person or group by name, but by way of seemingly legalistic phrasing to actually target someone deliberately. Then this phrasing can be justified by saying, well, if X didn't want to be subject to law Y, well, then he shouldn't do Z, ignoring the fact that part of the definition of what X is might be to do what is bothered with in law Y. Lots of tax law is like this, as I mentioned just a minute ago, and it is written as if the economy would be exactly the same if various highly productive individuals decided simply to not produce for 6 or 7 or 8 or 10 or 12 or 11 months out of the year. 12 would be a little much. Now, it is true that legislatures can ignore certain aspects of reality in order to pass laws that sound good, but those laws can have extremely destructive consequences, and there's no guardrails in Rousseau's system to avoid that kind of stuff. Rousseau continues, acts of sovereignty are only conventions between the body and members and cannot, quote, lay more charges on one subject than on another, because in that case the question becomes particular and ceases to be within its competency, end quote. This sounds good, but recall that in practice there are no clear distinctions between acts of sovereignty and acts of magistracy, and that people are bound in either case to obedience because they can't definitively tell the difference or shine light on the difference. Again, you could do all kinds of weird things where, and like if you take this literally, it can't lay more charges on one subject than another. Well, that would mean head tax only, right? Like, anything other than a pure head tax would be a problem for Rousseau's system, but I don't think he's going to go there. He continues, quote, it is seen to be so untrue that there is in the social contract any real renunciation on the part of the individuals that the position in which they find themselves as a result of the contract is really preferable to that in which they were before, end quote. This could be true with a limited government-style social contract or actual real contracts too. In fact, it necessarily would be if the contracts were actually voluntary. Rousseau has kind of painted himself into a corner with his sloppy language, because the social contract is by definition a very non-voluntary thing. There is no unanimity involved in the creation of the social contract, and, there's a lot of implied consent, etc., etc., etc. You can't leave it like you can a real contract. And the fact that the contract can change over time can mean that while something was advantageous at one point, it can become disadvantageous at a later point. And Rousseau is not coping with that possibility at all. Rousseau continues. He talks about how under the social contract there's more certainty, more security. Quote, instead of natural independence, they've got liberty. Instead of the power to harm others, security for themselves. And instead of their strength, which others might overcome, a right which social union makes invincible, end quote. This is rhetorical gibberish. Now, of course he wants to call whatever it is you get out of his social contract liberty. Of course he wants to call whatever you get out of his social contract security. And of course he wants to call whatever you get out of the social contract as a right which social union makes invincible, unless the social union decides it isn't. This is kind of very reminiscent of like 1984. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. Quote, all have indeed to fight when their country needs them, but then no one has ever to fight for himself, end quote. And of course, the iron law of oligarchy strikes again. The king and the officers do not risk their lives. The generals do not risk their lives, or at least they structure things so that risk is minimal. It's likely that George III was pissed off when Americans were shooting his officers, right? This kind of puts an end to chapter 4 of book 2. As we can see, Rousseau is kind of scrambling backwards, trying to show that his framework does offer some kinds of natural rights and some kind of limits on the government, but he's not doing a very good job. He says early on that only the sovereign can decide, and it is still true that the sovereign is just this phantom that will always be something that is declared by and enacted by a small subset of the society. He just can't really get around that. The only way that he could get around that is by assuming like pure direct democracy. And only if everybody votes does it kind of count thing. You can't make these assumptions and expect your logical system to continue when you're basically letting a small group of people. And even if he does, there's still the iron law of oligarchy, right? There's always going to be a group of people that control the parties, that control the groups, or even people that are just the bureaucrats that say, oh well, we should do this instead of this, and they make these tiny changes that actually have a large incentive effect. And Rousseau is just not dealing with any of this. All right, moving on to Book 2, Chapter 5, The Right of Life and Death, which is a strange, because it should be the power over life and death, not the right of life and death, but, well, we'll see where he's going with this. Rousseau begins. He begins very strangely with the assertion that individuals have no right to dispose of their own lives. I'm actually surprised that he hangs on to this element of Hooker's philosophy. He was hostile enough toward religion that I would imagine he would have dropped this point entirely. In any case, it's based on a specifically Christian bit of philosophy that is largely irrelevant to the wider argument. But he continues, quote, "Every man has a right to risk his own life in order to preserve it," end quote. Now, this is actually a good line that helps to point at something specific. Does God differentiate between simple suicide and serving a hopeless cause? The answer seems to be yes, since there's a patron saint for hopeless causes, at least in Christianity. The further question would be, if there is a self-consistent morality system, does it also differentiate between simple suicide and serving a hopeless cause? Do all of them, does every self-consistent morality system do so? Should they? Question mark, right? This is kind of a deeper philosophical point, and of course, we're not going to get to the bottom of that here because you could obviously kind of roll it over in your head in a variety of different ways. So we'll keep going. Rousseau continues by noting that the social contract has as its end the preservation of the people, and that must include the means. Now, the preservation of the people being the end of the social contract is very Lockean, but the fact that this must include the means is not actually that doesn't logically follow. It is, in fact, logically possible to aim at an uncertain end or a distant end and contractually limit the means, right? The uncertainty of means required to reach some ends, in fact, encourages people to consider what they would trade for that desired end. This is kind of economics 101. It's very basic. And it's, of course, also possible to aim at an end and only achieve it partially. These are all alternatives that are possible, and what basically Rousseau is doing is saying that, well, these are the ends that we have, and therefore everything can be taken from you as just means. Whereas in a more rational system, a person might say, here is the end we wish to aim at, but if it costs more than this, we must at least only accept partial achievement, or we must abandon it in some way. In fact, most of these kind of like lofty ideals can never be fully achieved, and so any government that is set to the end that cannot be achieved and can consume as much of the people's wealth as it needs to approach that end is a government that will basically bleed the people dry in order to reach something that it can't possibly reach. Continuing, Rousseau, quote, "He who wishes to preserve his life at others' expense should also, when it is necessary, be ready to give it up for their sake," end quote. Basically, man should be ready to die when the state declares it necessary, because his life is a gift from the state. This is not true, remember? The man had his life before he joined the state. Now the state is presuming to order him to throw away his life basically whenever it wants. Again, we have problems with limits on this power, which Rousseau is not talking about, and we have problems with the iron law of oligarchy, where this kind of thing can never be applied equally to everyone, and never will be. And that is another reason to kind of dislike Rousseau's framework here. It is necessarily unequal while aiming at equality that can never be reached. And will never be reached as long as humans are what they are, right? He said he was trying to look at man as he was, but he's doing a very bad job of it in general. Rousseau brings up a concept of justice. To summarize it, he says, we want to avoid being victims of crime X, therefore we consent to punishment up to and including death should we commit crime X. Now, this is very Lockean again. This is Rousseau's first hint at how sovereign law actually works. Remember, last time he said that actual points about like actual specific points are not part of law, but they are applications of law. Here he's saying that basically law is, okay, we want to avoid being victims of murder. Therefore, we all consent to being killed by the state should we commit murder. Now, ignoring the evidentiary problems with that, right? Like, you could be accused of murder but not actually have committed murder, or you could commit murder and nobody might know it, right? Those are all like serious practical problems that any realistic system has to deal with. But but what it does is basically it comes too late and it proves too much. He should have said this before he said that the state possesses absolute power over the individual and built up from there. He's trying to rescue his framework from becoming abject tyranny, but he's left way too many footholds and loopholes for places and phantoms for bad people to come in and take power. But he continues with this line of thought. This is not a quote, but it's a paraphrase. Criminals forfeit their membership in society and commit war against it. Well, this is contradictory, because if criminals exit society, then sovereign law isn't actually needed, right? At least in the sense that he just mentioned it above. If by committing murder, a person leaves society and commits war against society, then then he's not subject to the sovereign law anymore anyway, right? This is something outside of society now, and it can be dealt with however the people wish to. There's no consent from the attacker required for self-defense. So this whole thing doesn't make sense. He's basically saying that if you're a victim of crime X, then you're consenting to punishment. But if you commit crime X, then you're also out of society. Or, if you do anything that the sovereign decides is a crime, that you can be kicked out of society. This is the same problem, roughly, that Kropotkin had with his communes, right? You could be kicked out for any reason, and you didn't have any recourse. And not only that, but you couldn't take anything with you if you were kicked out of the commune. You'd basically be kicked naked out onto the street and starve to death, which is not a great way to organize a society to make it, strong against people harboring grudges or things like that. Rousseau notes that condemnation of criminals, quote, is not a function of the sovereign. It is a right the sovereign can confer without being able itself to exert it, end quote. But because criminals are outside the system, then his fairly good concept of justice I mentioned above is totally useless. Also, then society or people pretending to speak for society can declare anything a crime and punish anyone it wants. We're back at totalitarianism. He then, pleads again, quote, all my ideas are consistent, but I cannot expound them all at once, end quote. And, my response is, prove it, dude. He's doing a really bad job. He continues, the state cannot put to death those who can be rehabilitated or put to good use. Talk about a gray area. There's no clear way for society to determine that. That has to be determined by people and by individual cases, right? And so we're back to the point where you've just got a bunch of people that are rulers saying, you can be rehabilitated, you can't be rehabilitated. You can be rehabilitated, you can't be rehabilitated. And, it just ends up with the same kind of, political tyranny and political, targeting of political enemies that you would get in any tyrannical system. He doesn't provide any definition or explanation, and he really needs some. Final quote for this chapter. Quote, in a well-governed state there are few punishments, not because there are many pardons, but because criminals are rare, end quote. Remember, I mentioned this earlier, but again, Rousseau said early on he was talking about man as he is. And now he's like, well, if government's good, then people won't commit crimes very much. And it's like, well, that doesn't follow, right? It might be true, but it might also not be true. And Rousseau's system has so much leeway for different things to be the case that you could have a bunch of different governments that claim to be general wills for these particular individual groups of people, right? And they're all different governments. They all claim to be Rousseauian, and they all have different levels of crime. And then we also have the problem that the sovereign, right, the general will, is kind of infallible, right? Rousseau mentions this earlier in Book 1. And, that's you can't distinguish between well-governed states and ill-governed states if the state is infallible. It is, by definition, correct, right? It's also worth noting that Kropotkin did this kind of stuff too, where he's like, well, we won't need policemen anymore when everybody is in a commune. It's like, well, are you sure? And he's like, yeah, don't worry about it. And it's not a good assumption. I'll link in the show notes to the part of his book where I talk about this, but it's a really stupid assumption that people will suddenly not commit crimes for reasons other than inequality. Or right, like even if I have the same amount as 50 other people around me, I still can want to have more stuff by taking some from the other 50 people around me. Even if I don't actually care about having more stuff, I still might commit crime for the thrill or the fun or just as a matter of spite. There's all kinds of things that things that motivate people to crime. And if you want to create a system that actually deals with man as he is, you can't just sweep this under the rug by saying that all crime is the effect of bad government or inequality. These are just not true things. So, that finishes Chapter 5 of Book 2. That is all I've got for this week. We will come back next week with some more. I think he's talking about law in the next 2 chapters, so we'll probably cover those 2 next time. But yeah. Analysis and critique of Rousseau's social contract. I like doing these because I always read that these books are bad, but like frequently I find that like people who say that they're bad are relying on someone else who said they were bad, right? This is what happened with Kropotkin, right? I said, well, Rothbard and Mises say he's dumb, but maybe he's not. And so, you just got to investigate these things on your own. That's why I kind of like these. So if you like this kind of stuff, or if you like my other content, feel free to check out my blog. If you want to support the channel, you know what to do. And yeah, that is what I've got for this week, and I will see you next time with, I don't know, it might be, I've got a couple of things in the pipe, but we'll see how completion goes. Anyway, have a good weekend, and I will see you all later.